Okay.
Wonderful. Recording in progress. So thank you so much, Rabbi Miller, for that beautiful introduction. And it's truly an honor to be with all of you at the little show by the river tonight. It's a really rare privilege for me to be able to combine the two things that I love most, thinking about belonging in Jewish community and doing contemplative practice together. So I'm extraordinarily excited to be delving into that and melding the two together. And I want to kind of describe a little bit of the arc of the evening. We're going to begin just momentarily. We're going to begin with a brief sit. For folks who have a meditation practice, this will be a 3-minute sit. I'm going to invite us to sit with an anchor. I'm going to describe what that means in a moment for those of us who are less familiar. We're going to then, once we come out of that sit, we're going to take a minute to just transition back to the Zoom space, and then we're going to move into some Talmud Torah. And we're going to be learning a text from the Talmud, from Taanit, which is a tractate in the Talmud. I'll be talking a lot more about exactly what this text is that we're going to be learning. And we're going to be learning it with attention paid to two, I believe, distinct but interconnected questions. The first of the questions we'll be thinking about when we get there is, what does it mean to be soft like a reed and not to be hard like a cedar? When we think about that from a mindfulness perspective, but when we also think about that from a justice perspective, and you'll get a sense of more what I mean by that when we get there. So that's the first piece of this. And then we'll have a discussion. I'm going to do what I often do when I teach this text, is you all have the source sheet. I find it is more effective for my own teaching style and also just being on Zoom in general. I find it is far more effective to really kind of teach the text by telling the text and not by reading the text. So you all should have the actual text in front of you. And what I want to encourage you to do is feel free to follow along as I am telling you the text. And then we're going to, and when I say telling it, what I mean is I'm not going to go what we call in the world of the Talmud, I'm not going to read it inside, meaning we're not going to do a deep textual dive and looking at all the words and figuring out the roots, and super important skill to have. That's not what we're doing tonight. So once we go through the text together, we're going to then open it for the remainder of the time into a conversation, and that can either happen via the chat or if you want to unmute. And what I'm going to ask folks to do is, I'm not able to access the chat while I'm teaching. So Rabbi Diana is going to keep an eye on the chat. I'm going to pause while I'm presenting if anything comes through, but we're going to save most of the questions and comments for after the text. And then what I also would love to encourage folks to do is, if you want to unmute, to raise your Zoom hand. And I try to take multiple questions at a time because I want to be able to hear all the voices in the room. And I just gently encourage us all, we don't have a ton of time, so let's try to remember to keep our questions brief and keep them questions as much as we can. So with that as an intro, I want to now invite us. We're going to start in a moment our 3-minute guided sit, but I first want to invite folks to find a comfortable posture. And as one of my teachers reminds me all the time, there are 4 typical postures. Now, when I say typical, I mean there are 4 often suggested postures in meditation: sitting, standing, walking, or lying down. You may find that there is a 5th posture that is better for you. Our goal here is to find a comfortable posture that allows our body to relax but be alert. We are not looking to be sleepy. I know it's getting to be evening for all of us, but we are trying to be relaxed and alert. I'm going to invite folks to turn inward. So whether that means closing your eyes to block visual stimuli, whether it means closing all of the external windows on your computer to block digital stimuli, whatever it is, please do what you need to do to turn inward. And I want to invite us in this guided practice. We're going to do a very simple practice. I want us to find an anchor. An anchor is that thing that we return to again and again when our attention wanders. I find personally that an anchor that I find to be more sustainable is actually sound, is not my breath, but is sound. A lot of people focus on the breath. If that works for you, wonderful, do that. If sound is a better anchor, do that. If finding a spot in your room and focusing on that is better for you, do that. Whatever your anchor is, we are going to try to remain focused on our anchor and just notice what arises and notice what falls away. Very simple mindfulness presencing practice. So I'm going to invite us to now start the meditation timer, and we'll sit for 3 minutes together. I want to invite us all to return to the Zoom space. Thank you, Rabbi Diana, for that beautiful timer. I'm going to have to get the name of that app because that's just beautiful. Yeah, let's all return to our Zoom space. And so why do we practice? Why do we sit? Why is that important to do when we're beginning what feels like a very heady process, very intellectual process? And ultimately because it allows us to be present with our own experience. That's ultimately what we're trying to get at here. With a lot of compassion for ourselves, it allows us to be in the present moment. We live in a world where we are moving a mile a minute all the time, and sitting in practice really allows us to pause and to reorient and reset. And it also allows us to enter into the sacred act of learning Torah with a bit more of what we call a yeshuv hada'at, a settled mind, a little bit of a calmer mind. And those of us who've been practicing a while know the phenomenon of the monkey mind, which I certainly have in great abundance, and the importance of learning how to navigate that and learning how to use it productively. So I'm grateful to be with all of you as we are settling in and as we've done that practice together. We're now going to turn to our learning. And I want to note a couple of things, that we are going to be focusing on a piece from Talmud in the Tractate of Taanit. In the Torah reading cycle right now, we are in Parshiyot Vayakel Pekudei, the final two Parshiyot in Sefer Shmot, in the book of Exodus. We are completing the building of the Mishkan, that place of sacred service that we carried with us in Bamidbar in the desert. And as we do so, we are aware of the place that it served for our ancestors in the desert, however you believe that happened. It's a sacred part of our story. And as we do, we understand that every single one of us contributed. That's what the Torah tells us in Parashat Terumah, that every single person brought something to contribute to this Mishkan. I think it is not without coincidence that we're going to be talking about craftspeople in our learning together in Talmud. And the Mishkan was certainly a work of incredible craftsmanship, and that was, or craftspersonship, and that was where the divine presence was understood to dwell. We have in Judaism, there's a very, classic idea that God is everywhere and dwells everywhere, but certainly in the context of the Mishkan was this indwelling place for the divine presence. So we're going to be kind of moving into a place of thinking about, and I also want to name, we all have different relationships to the divine. We all use different words. Some of us may not believe in the divine. I invite us all to translate as appropriate, and I do not assume any particular orientation. I use God language, but I do so expansively, and I don't in any way assume any kind of particular connection or idea around what the divine is. So that's just a piece of a disclaimer. And the reason I bring that up is it's going to come up quite a bit in our text. So a little bit about the text, and if you have the source sheet, please have it with you. I don't know, Rabbi Diana, would it make sense to share the screen? I am not able to screen share on my end, but
yeah, I can screen share it. Does anyone need? Sure, I can do that.
That'd be great, unless everyone.
Well, does everybody have it? Who needs it? Because I mailed it out to I think everybody on this list. So I think they all have it, honestly.
Great. If you all have it, please have it open. That's perfect. And we don't need a screen share. Fantastic.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay. So have it open. As I said before, I am not going to be reading it to you. You should follow along. I'm going to be telling it. I'm going to be narrating the text. So have it with you. Also, as a note, this text I got from Sefaria, and thank God for Sefaria. It's an incredible resource of Jewish text online, free to anyone and everyone. The edition of the Talmud on Sefaria is the Steinsaltz Talmud, which is an incredible work of scholarship. Just know that anything in bold is the actual text of the Talmud, and anything that is not bolded is the commentary, and they get woven together. So just bear that in mind, that the translation that we're working with tonight is Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation, and his commentary is woven throughout. So we're just going to take that as part of the translation.
Okay.
So what is this tractate? We are looking at a particular narrative text that comes in the third chapter of Masechet Taanit. Taanit is a tractate of Gemara that is found in what is called Seder Moed. Seder Moed literally means the order. You probably all know the word Seder. The order of the holidays, Moed, or the appointed times. There are 6 orders in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the foundational text on which the Talmud is based, and the Talmud includes. And Ta'anit is primarily focused on fast days. So in the time of the Gemara in particular, and the Mishnah also, there would be fasts declared if rain did not fall in very particular ways and at very particular times. And in the land of Israel, this is an incredibly important thing because there is the rainy season and there is the dry season. And if you do not get the rain that you need in the right time, that can have a really deleterious impact upon your livelihood. So if the rain did not fall by particular calendrical dates, different kind of fasts would be declared depending on the severity of the situation. And in the midst of all of this discussion, this chapter is extremely famous. One of the things it also includes, for folks who may be aware, is the entire story cycle of Choni HaMagel, of Choni the circle maker. And this story comes close to the end of this chapter, I believe. And it is a really interesting story because it's talking about rabbinic misbehavior. And it's hard to know from how the story is kind of situated whether or not this is something that's being told after the fact, and whether or not the protagonist is aware of the way in which he made a mistake. It's very ambiguous, which I think is one of the reasons why it is such an incredible text. So I'm going to describe and tell the story, and I'm also at the same time going to make some notes as we go. So our text begins with Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon entering the Beit Midrash. So he's entering the study house and he's saying to his Talmidim, to his students there, one should not be hard like a cedar, but should be soft like a reed. One should be soft like a reed and not hard like a cedar. So why? What happened here? Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught. One day, Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon was riding on his donkey, and he was traveling from a place called Migdal Gadur, which I want to pause and note that Migdal Gadur, and I learned this from my teacher, Rabbi Tali Adler, Migdal Gadur is the great tower, or the mighty tower, or the high tower. So let's bear that in mind. He's traveling from this place called Migdal Gadur, and he's been learning with his rabbi all day, and he's feeling extremely proud of himself because he's learned all of this Torah. And he's riding along, and his heart's all puffed up, and he's like, how great and learned am I? Now, another biographical note about Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, which I think is very important to know. He is the son of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Shimon bar Yochai is a very famous Tana. He's a very famous rabbi of the Mishnah. He is the one, if you're familiar at all with his stories, he is the one who's in the cave for 12 years, sitting with his son up to their necks in sand, his son, of course, being Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. And he's sitting with his son, and he's in the cave, and he emerges from the cave after 12 years. Excuse me one second. He emerges out of the cave after 12 years, and he emerges into the world, and he doesn't like how the people are behaving, and he looks at them, and his eyes become lasers, and everything's burned up, and when God says to him, well, if this is how you're going to behave towards my people, you need to go back into the cave. Clearly, you're not ready to be in the world yet. You have this arrogant streak about you. You need to go back into the cave. So he goes back into the cave for another 12 years. So bear in mind that Elazar ben Shimon has been living, or has lived, a considerable amount of time in a very, very secluded location. And he's on this road now, and he's been with his rabbi. We don't know who the rabbi is, but he's been learning with his rabbi, and he's on this road, and he encounters a man. And the only thing that the Gemara tells us about the man is that he is ugly. Now, we don't even know what that means. We don't know anything about this man other than he is greeted. I mean, he greets Rabbi. Let me start that over. He greets Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon and says, greetings to you, my rabbi. And Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon says, ugh, Reka, ugly man. Are all of the people of your city as ugly as you? And we're all probably thinking, wow, what kind of lack of awareness is that, right? That is atrocious. You're thinking like, oh my goodness. So what does this man say in response? I don't know, but perhaps you should go to the craftsman, capital C, who created me, and say to the craftsman, how ugly is the vessel you made? So think about the fact that this rabbi has been learning all day and then treats somebody with such disregard. If only this was some abstract tale that had no bearing on leadership today, right? If only this was something that was just like, oh, wow, people used to do that. That's terrible. Unfortunately, this is probably hitting a lot of us very closely these days. So Rabbi Elazar realizes he's offended the man. Now the question emerges. Now we don't actually know, and I have my own read on this, but I want to hear from others as well. Rabbi Elazar gets down off of his donkey. He prostrates himself fully because he's realized he's totally insulted this man, and he's begging for forgiveness. So I'm imagining he's prostrating, and they are continuing to travel towards Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon's city. So that is quite a posture of humiliation and supplication. But the man does not forgive him until he goes to the craftsman who created him and says, how ugly is the vessel you made? So then they get to the town, and there are throngs of townspeople, and they come and they said, greetings to you, my rabbi, my master. And this gentleman, who we never hear his name, says to these folks, who are you calling my rabbi, my master, my master? And the townsfolk say, well, of course, we're talking about Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. And this gentleman says, well, why are you calling him my rabbi, my rabbi? He did this horrible thing to me on the road. And the townspeople say, oh, but will you please forgive him? He's such a great Torah scholar. And the man says in response, well, I will forgive him on the condition that he does not become accustomed to behave this way, and that there are not many like him amongst the people Israel. Our text ends there, and then we get a postscript that Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon has entered the Beit Midrash and teaches that one should be soft like a reed and should not be hard like a cedar. And it's because the reed is soft that the reed merited to become a quill, and the quill is then used to write mezuzot and tefillin, and the Torah scroll. So all of these sacred objects are written with the reed. The reed is soft, the reed is gentle, unlike the cedar, which is hard and stiff. And then this text ends, leaving us with far more ambiguity than certainty. And when I'm teaching this text specifically in a disability justice framework, which I do quite often, I think it's one of the most powerful texts I have yet encountered to allow us to open up to a question around disability justice, which we might do a little bit of tonight, but I really want us to also have a very contemplative orientation as we're looking at this. I would often ask my learners in that case, what do you think? Do you think Rabbi Elazar did tshuva? Do you think he didn't do tshuva? Who's the one that's being harder or softer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I think what I want to invite us to engage, those questions I think are very important, but I also want us to think about what is softness, actually? Because many folks could read this text, and I've often encountered people who read it this way as, well, the ugly man was really harsh. He was extremely harsh, he was insulted, and then how does he respond? He says, well, I'm not going to forgive you until you go to the craftsman and who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? And further, I don't really want to ever forgive you, and may people not become accustomed to be like you amongst the people of Israel. That feels really hard. It's like, oh, this man made a terrible choice. Why are we responding to him in that way? And that often comes from the perspective of someone, and this is all of us, by the way, who has stepped in it. I don't know anybody in this world, myself very much included, who hasn't totally stepped in it many times and has been like, oh my gosh, what did I do? I can't believe I said that thing or thought that thing or whatever the case may be. And we're thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, can I ever be made whole again from this experience? Like, what does this say about me as a human being? So from that perspective, right, it can feel like this reka, which also means empty one. Unfortunately, we don't get a name, and I think that that's intentional. It says like, oh, well, he's being really hard. I mean, Rabbi Elazar, he's not had a ton of social contact. I mean, he's been in this cave with his father for 24 odd years. How long has he been out of the cave from, time he's learning with his rabbi to now? Like, all of those questions that we moderns probably are thinking about. On the other hand, what does it mean when one stands up and makes an incredible theological pronouncement? Go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made. When you insult another human being made in the divine image, meaning that we all have that inherent divinity and divine spark and sense of worth and sense of inherent value that cannot be taken away. If you insult one of us, you have insulted God, and you've insulted all of the things that you claim to be dedicating your life to. Have you actually learned the lesson that your father had to be taught or not? Now, we don't know if this man knows anything about who Rabbi Elazar is. We don't even know why he thinks that Elazar is a rabbi, but okay, that's part of the text here. And what does it mean to say, this really, really hurt my neshama? The way that you spoke to me really hurt my neshama. So you now turning around and saying, please, can you forgive me? Well, we know in Judaism that the way that we as Jews think about forgiveness, and I don't assume that everyone is Jewish on this call, so I'll say that another way too. In the Jewish tradition, we think about forgiveness as Rabbi Danya Rittenberg in her really incredible book called On Repentance and Repair, which I think everyone should read. Forgiveness is not the first thing. Forgiveness is the last thing. And it only happens once the person who has been harmed feels that the person who perpetrated the harm has done the tshuva, the reparative work. And that reparative work often has to happen within the perpetrator themselves before they can then go and ask the other person for forgiveness. So it can also feel like, wow, how quick, I stepped in it in a big way and I'm really embarrassed and please forgive me. It's a very human reaction. But the other gentleman is saying, well, wait a second. No, not until you've actually really thought about what you've done, or what we say in Musar, you've done a real cheshbon nefesh, you've done a real soul accounting and asked yourself, like, if I am someone who's learning Torah, how could I behave in such an abhorrent way? Now, unfortunately, and we're not going to go here tonight because I want to make sure we keep our topic pretty solid, but we know, and I think the rabbis include this text very deliberately for this reason, that I believe it's Nachmanides, the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachmanides, who says that actually it is entirely possible to be a jerk within the laws of Torah, right? That as we say from the book of Proverbs, when we are putting the Torah away, that all of her paths are paths of peace and the Torah is a tree of life. Yes. And we as human beings have a bechira point, a choice point, again, another concept from Musar, where we have every day, we encounter lots of ways to make choices about our behavior, the words we say, what comes out of our mouth. It's a real spiritual discipline. And when done with a lot of love and compassion towards ourselves, it makes us able to show up much more holistically. So I think that this gentleman, I mean, I am, of course, reading this from my perspective, where as somebody with a disability, unfortunately, the way that Rabbi Elazar behaved towards this other gentleman. This is not a far-fetched idea to me, unfortunately. I wish it were. This is not a far-fetched idea. What I find incredible is that it's in the Talmud. And when I teach this in disability-specific settings, I get many, many people saying, oh my gosh, finally, there's somebody that's resonating. You know, if we were to really, really take a deep dive into ourselves, we would probably find things we are not super proud of. And that's why we have to find that accountability with others and to do so in a way that is compassionate, especially for those of us who are women or were socialized as women, who are always told that we have to be small and are so prone to beating ourselves up. It can feel like, oh my gosh, now you're telling me I've got to be like working on myself even more. It's done with love and compassion, not with discipline, not with a sense of I'm never enough, I'm never enough. We're constantly having to work on that. And I think that in this text, the gentleman here is saying, I know that you've done that work. And this is a good opportunity for you to really do that work. So on that note, I'm going to pause and I'm going to now open it up to some discussion. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rabbi Hannah.
I am definitely, I don't have anything in the chat right now, but I'd like to say one thing and then open it up. Is just, this is reminding me a little bit of certain people in the entertainment world who did things that were less than wonderful behavior, somewhere between sexual harassment to worse. Not Harvey Weinstein, but people who, you know, they were supposed to go, they wanted to apologize and come right back. And people were like, no, 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 no. It's not just about apologizing. It's about showing that you truly understand your behavior. That takes time. You can't do that right away. Maybe you can come back, because if we really believe in teshuvah, and it's not, you know, so this is such a familiar and modern conversation. And so I want to take the time now to just see how other people are responding to this text. Jane.
So thank you very much. This is really interesting. And you said something a little earlier, Rabbi Tuchman, about you know, that he was a rabbi, and you know, maybe because he had been sort of sequestered for so long, he you know, that was an excuse or whatever. But what came to me, and Rabbi Diane, what you just said came to me as well, that when you have someone who is seen as and puts themselves out as a leader and as an example, I think that the fact that the man who was wronged, some people think his reaction might have been too harsh. I think that it rationalizes the harshness, because here you have someone who's supposed to be a leader, an influencer, someone that others look up to as to the way of doing things. And I think that thereby there's even a greater amount of accountability. And so what you were just saying, Rabbi Diana, about, you know, celebrities or people who, you know, say, oh, I'm sorry, and I've got it, and it's not going to happen again type of thing. It's similar if you think about society as a whole, as to who is looked up to as a leader, as an influencer, as an example. So that's why when I was reading it and then listening to you, I didn't think that it was an overreaction, that he was harsh. Yeah, he was, but I think that all things were not necessarily equal.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. Yeah, do we have any more before I respond to that?
Anyone? No? Okay. Oh, David has one. Yeah. Unmute, please.
Thank you. I mean, it's kind of shocking, the rabbi's response, and it makes you question what is the value of all of his study that he's so proud of, that he could judge somebody on their appearance so graphically. It makes you feel that it's deep inside him. This is like an immediate response, notwithstanding all his study. It reminds me, I studied a while back in a little Torah study in somebody's home, and it was, it was really nice and deep. And the minute it was over, I heard him in another room screaming into the phone. He was back in his business mode, and it was pretty shocking given where we came from. And, so I don't think it was an overreaction. Frankly, I think that he got off easy. I didn't, when the people said, forgive him, and he said, for their sake, he'll forgive him if he sort of apologizes to or identifies with the maker. I think that was kind of easy, and I didn't really understand it, other than he wanted to allow the people to maintain their idea of what a rabbi is or should be, and sort of let them off. But it still seemed unwarranted. He told them the truth of what the rabbi did, and I think it was, I think he let him off, but I don't think it was harsh at all. And I think this rabbi has a lot of repentance to do and has to dig deep, because that reaction was, betrayed, a deep flaw in him.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take these two comments and then we'll, I'm sure, hear more. So I am entirely with you. Not only do I think that Rabbi Elazar gets off very easy, as you say, David, but also I think that the way that I understand the story, and again, I'm reading it through my own experience, is that sometimes it is just, you calculate, unfortunately, we've probably all been there. You make a calculation where you're like, I can either push this and get even angrier, or I can effectively write this guy off. Like, I think of the gentleman, I'm calling him the gentleman because I don't want to use the term ugly man to refer to a human being. But this other gentleman may have, in his own way, been like, you know what? It's just not worth it. And generally, in my experience, when people write people off that way, especially after having been so mistreated, it's because the calculation is like, look, this guy's not going to change. I mean, I'm letting the people keep their, affection for their rabbi. And ultimately, I've seen this type before. This guy's not going to change. And like, I've got other things to do. And like, I've been deeply insulted and I really don't need to engage. Like, that is one interpretation. And ultimately that is based on my own lived experience. That happens quite a bit, not only in terms of disability microaggressions, although this is certainly a macroaggression, but also in terms of thinking about issues of racial justice and racist micro and macroaggressions. Like, these are calculations that people make all the time. And I very much agree with you that he really did get off easy. But I think that the fact that this is memorialized in the Talmud is not a small thing, because the rabbis of the Talmud were effectively writing for themselves. So the fact that they are willing to remember this terrible incident, I think, is crucially important. And I also want to just respond to your Torah study anecdote. See, this is why we practice, right? Because if we can so easily move from a place of, deep connection to Torah, and then in the next room, we're back in our business mode and we're yelling in the phone, well, the question that emerges, I would hope for all of us, is the following. Have we actually learned anything or not? Is this something we do intellectually? Have we actually made this a part of our spiritual practice, or is this just an intellectual exercise? Have we actually transformed from the inside out, or is this just, I'm learning these really cool concepts? That's why we practice. Rabbi Jonathan Slater, who recently retired from IJS, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, often would talk about how we are very much, as American Jews, we are Jews from the neck up, in the sense that we are very much in our head all of the time, and that is a trauma response. I mean, this is these are my words. I don't know what he would say, but I don't think he would disagree with this. That in a lot of ways is a response to the trauma that we've experienced as a people. It is easier and safer to be intellectual and in the head than it is to actually then transform ourselves. And that's, I think, what this text study is, or this particular text in Talmud is really asking us to do, is to reflect. We can hold it up to ourselves and ask ourselves the question, how have I shown up in the world? How do I treat other people? How do I treat myself? How do I treat the people closest to me and those further away? Because ultimately, how I treat those in my orbit, as I think all understand now, like, that's not just an internal issue. That affects everything and everyone around depending on what your circle of influence is. And how do we show up? If one has a healthy sense of self and one is practicing whatever they're practicing spiritually and one feels grounded or however that manifests for you, I don't know that it would be so possible to make such a horrifically terrible statement. I notice that the more secure we are, the less of a desire we have to judge other people. The less secure we are, like I had a moment this past week. Rabbi Diana, as she said in the beginning, she and I are in a meditation program together. And I was finding that we had a program this past week, and I was finding that part of that program, I was in such a strong judgment mind. I mean, to the point where I decided I actually needed to get up and do some walking around to like rejigger myself. And it was like, wow, okay, this is here and it's telling me something really important, but what is my choice going to be with this thing? Am I going to work with it, or am I going to try to stuff it down? And often, and that's what I believe mindfulness really allows us to do. When a thought arises, we don't have to be that thought. It's like, oh, I'm really in judgment mind. Like, I'm in deep judgment mind right now because the instructions are really not working for me. And so then I start spiraling. Well, the instructions are not working for me, therefore, why am I in this program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and there's no end. End of ourself, as we say in Hebrew, right? End of ourself. There's no end to it. Like, if Rabbi Elazar, upon seeing this other gentleman in the road, could have paused for a fraction of a second and been like, oh, that's different. This is not what I'm used to. How am I going to respond? I hope the answer is I'm going to respond the way that I'd respond to any other person by saying Shalom Aleichem. It's clearly not what he did. But what do you do if you can take that additional second or two to just notice and then be able to respond from a much more aware place? That's ultimately what we're trying to do. And I do think that we experience in this text just the way in which, when that doesn't happen, there can be so much danger.
Rabbi Tuchman, there are 3 people who have their hands up.
Please, yes, let's take all of them.
Tammy and Lynn, and then Julie.
What I wanted to say is that the concepts of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov just keep coming into my mind, the inclination for evil and the inclination for good, right? And the idea of being mindful is recognizing when that inclination for evil maybe wants to like rear its ugly head, right? And you take that pause like you were talking about, Rabbi Tuchman. And so I think that so many of the concepts in what I've learned about Jewish law kind of all come back to some of the same things all the time. And I think this is one of them.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. We have 2 more comments.
Yeah, Lynn and then Julie. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thanks, Tammy. Thank you, Rabbi Tuchman. This is Lynn Goldman. So my head's going on so many things. One, that they tell the story because it's for each person. You should never be proud. You should never be like, oh, how good am I? I'm such a good person. And when all these people are studying and thinking, wow, I've got this down cold, So it's wonderful that it is in here to say, even, a scholar. I think in our day-to-day lives, we may not out and out say to someone, you're ugly or whatever, but we make many assumptions. And then our behaviors and our tone and our words follow those assumptions. And that's harder. And then the other thing that you talked about, Musar, and this idea of a continuum of behavior. I want to be good. I want to do the right thing. Sometimes I'm too hard on myself. So it's like how to bring the compassion in. A conversation I was having with someone today, it was like, I need to take care of myself. But then I was feeling guilty that I wasn't taking care of someone else. And it's constantly moving on that continuum to being a better person. So that's just some of the thoughts I had based on what you were talking about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lynn, for that. Absolutely. And we have one more comment right now, right?
Yes, Julie.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for leading this. So I'm sort of focusing on the person who was insulted, but I love his response because he says, I don't know, like, go find out, like, I don't know if we're ugly. Like for him, he was just fine. So really, if you look at it like that, his response was a very kind response, very compassionate. It was go do some soul searching or go, talk to the craftsman and find out. So I kind of liked his strength and his kindness in directing him to where he can find the answer.
Julie, that was a beautiful read. And I want to respond to Tammy, Lynn, and Julie. I'm going to kind of do so together. But I just want to say, Julie, to your read, I think that that's really beautiful that there was a certain kindness in the response, which gets us back to the softness. Like that was a soft response. If we go with your read, which I think is really beautiful, it's, I don't know, like I'm fine, but I know you're having a difficulty. Go talk to the craftsman who created me and say, well, how ugly is this vessel you made? And that's, I think, also the piece of it, right? So often we want things and we expect things to be a particular kind of way because that's just what we expect as people living in the world. And when we don't understand somebody else's life experience, and I'm thinking specifically right now about disability, and also disability is complicated. Like lots of people have lots of different, perspectives on it, particularly in the disability community. Everyone has their own unique experience. But I will say that most of us are probably in the camp of those who say, you know what, like this is who we are. And like this is a part of the human condition. And like, that's it. And it doesn't mean, and life can be really, really challenging. And like, that doesn't negate, like, this is who I am. And I'm, glad to be who I am in the world, right? So again, I want to make a massive disclaimer that of course I am extraordinarily transposing like very modern ideas about disability onto a very ancient text. But I think it can serve as a mirror for us to think about how we understand ourselves. And then to the point that, Lynn, I think you made about Musar and the continuum of behavior, right? So in Musar, there's this idea that every human being has every midah within ourselves. So a midah is a measure or a trait. Often they're called soul traits. We all have them all. We all have them in different degrees. And the goal in Musar, maybe the goal is the wrong word, but what we're trying to do is like really be, as a spiritual practice, be very balanced in our midot and be as a way of deeper spiritual connection to ourselves, to each other, and to the divine and all of that. Through how we show up in the world, because it's all interconnected. And I think that that's exactly it, that sometimes, like, if we were to actually record ourselves, how do we behave to those closest to us? I think it was a Western Buddhist teacher who said, you can feel you're so enlightened, then go be with family, and see how enlightened you really are then, right? Or close friends or whomever it is. I think we all can do that. And, none of us is exempt from that. So it's just something that we need to be aware of. And it's just, again, with the compassion, but also when we feel like we have been insulted, to say, like, no, like, my kavod habriot, my dignity is really important. And, even though in Parkei Avot it says that being a kavod seeker, being someone who seeks honor, can remove one from the world, again, if we're being balanced, if you are standing up for your own human dignity, I think that is not only not kavod seeking as is described in Parkei Avot, but I think it's actually quite the opposite. It's actually the softness and the kindness of saying, I'm not going to let you treat me this way. I'm going to be the full person that I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Do we have a few more questions? We've got some time, so we will end with another closing practice, but I would love to hear if we've got a few more questions, comments, thoughts, reflections.
Jane has, Tammy and Tammy and Jane. I saw
Jane. Go ahead,
Jane, and then Tammy.
Okay, so you said something, and I liked what you said, Julie, about, I think it was Julie, or maybe it was Lynn, about, it was actually, the man's response was actually kind, because he said, go learn more, go understand more, go find out. And I work with, and have for many, many years, with people with a range of varying abilities, primarily due to different genetic and rare diseases. And what I find particularly interesting and more consistent as people are more empowered with who they are and their dignity, and of course, as our society is getting a little bit more sensitive to the differences in people. But and I'm thinking of one young lady in particular who I think she was probably still in high school or college when and she's in a wheelchair and she's vented and she's trached, and she was in the mall in Princeton, and somebody was sort of staring at her, a child, and was with the mother. And the mother was, telling the kid, don't do this, you shouldn't stare, it's not polite, whatever. And what she said, and I don't know if it was with her mom or she was with her nurse, who said, no, actually, it's okay. And why don't you ask me any questions that you have? And so I know, of people who will use that as an opportunity so that there's a little bit of a bridge and it's not as uncomfortable. So where somebody might have that, that innate reaction that this is different, that this, and I'm looking at this person because they look different or they're acting different, but sometimes it's recognized as an ignorance that needs to be educated in some way. And so I just wanted, because I've been thinking about that through this discussion this evening. And even my own son, when he was about 6 or 7 years old, He was with Bruce, he was with my husband. They were in a restaurant or something. He was a little boy and saw a child who had hydrocephalus, right? Who had a very large head. And he couldn't stop looking. And my husband said, it's not polite to stare. And he said, I know that, Dad, but it's so interesting. And I think that that's in some ways where we need as a society to get, is to find that, is to truly be interested in somebody else and what their experience is, and to learn from that. And so that was just my comment, not really a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that reflection.
And was it
Did
Tim?
we-
Go on, Rabbi Tuchman, go, sorry.
No, I was going to say, did we have another comment?
Yeah, it was me again. This is something I forgot to mention before. So I think the question about, soft like a reed or hard like a cedar, I think the soft like a reed is what we've all been sort of like, emulating and valuing here. But I think that it's impossible for anybody to be soft like a reed all the time, or it's impossible to be hard like a cedar all the time. And these are sort of like two parts of us that we always have to mediate. And with mindfulness and reflection and hard work, we can try to strengthen the part of us that's softer, right? But again, it's that I just don't, to suggest that a rabbi should never have made that kind of a mistake. I mean, life is a process, right? And people are, I think, one step before, one step back, two steps forward, right? That's kind of the way life is.
Yeah, and I really want to appreciate both of these comments, and I'm going to kind of address them in reverse order. One of the things I really appreciate, Tammy, that you just said is about the rabbi, like, life is complicated. We are all in process for sure, right? And I think that we live in a culture right now in particular that doesn't have a lot of room for the process. And this again is where I go back to the very helpful Musar concept of the Bechira point. So I want to bring that up in relationship to what Jane was describing, which is that when this young woman who was in the mall had that encounter with that child, she could choose how she wanted to encounter that situation, right? Often you'll hear in some parts of the disability community, and I think for very good reason, like, it's not our job to constantly be educating. Sometimes we just want to eat a bagel with kiddush. And I think that that's really true, right? That sometimes we just want to eat a bagel. And if you've been told your whole life, like, I have to be educating all of the time and I have to be creating these bridges all of the time, it gets really exhausting. You just want to be a person. I think you can also tell very quickly whether somebody is actually interested in you because of you, or if they're interested in you just because they have a curiosity and then they're going to move on to the next thing. So that's just one of those kind of senses that you kind of get over time if you're a person that gets kind of questions a lot. So in the incident that Jane, that you so beautifully reflected on with us, I would say that that is a use of the Bechira point that this woman had, where she said, you know what, I'm going to engage with this child because I want to normalize. I mean, this is kind of like my projection of what she might have been thinking. The sooner kids are normalized around disability, the better for our society. If we don't allow kids to become, to think that disability is a normal thing, we're going to continue to have the degree of ableism that we deal with every day. So that is one way of chipping at that. And then I want to address again the comments about the rabbi. So I think that it's absolutely true. I mean, like, we have all said things and done things, and I don't know, and Rabbi Diana, I'd be curious if you have any experience, like, any wisdom on this as well. I don't know of any rabbi who hasn't had a moment or 5 or 20 where they're like, I cannot believe I did that. I am just a person in the world.
Oh. And we have mentors and colleagues.
Exactly.
They're like, I can't believe I did that. Right. So everyone does, and whatever our things are, our roles.
Everyone does. Exactly. You just preempted. Thank you, Rabbi Diana. You literally just preempted what I was going to say. This is why you have mentorship, and this is why you have colleagues. Because if you are really aligned with these things in yourself, like, oh, I need to consult with a colleague on X, Y, and Z issue because this thing happened and I probably said this terrible thing and I didn't mean to, right? I don't know if Rabbi Elazar had those colleagues. And I think it's a good reminder to anybody who is in any kind of leadership role or in any kind of relationship where they are seen as an authority figure, which many of us are in different parts of our lives, just to be aware of the way that that can manifest. And I do think we need to have, I think you're right, that we're never soft like a reed all of the time. We just aren't. Like, we're human beings. And that's where, to go back to the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Ra, the inclination for good and the inclination for bad, or really poor choices. I mean, that's why Judaism places such an emphasis, right, on personal responsibility for how we show up in the world. I mean, that's a critical piece of this. With, again, the idea of compassion and love, like those things exist simultaneously and in equal measure, right? It's not one or the other. And when we are allowing ourselves to soften and to be with ourselves as we are, we end up being able to do so much more because we're not constantly beating ourselves up. You know, and some of the earlier, like 19th century schools of Musar were very, I mean, excruciatingly self-critical. And I will say, as a woman in this work, even though I find Musar to be extraordinarily powerful for all of the reasons that I'm describing today, it was not actually going to be all about Musar. It just keeps coming up. I'm sorry about that, friends. I'm sorry about that, friends. Anyway, so it is still, I mean, we have to, especially for us as modern folk who have been really taught to be very hard on ourselves, we have to constantly be aware of that tendency. And we have to constantly, there are times when it's really important to be self-judgmental. Like, if we've done a really terrible thing, like, we need to do the reparative work. But so often we are terrible towards ourselves and then we're terrible towards other people. So if we can soften a little bit and encounter ourselves with a lot more love and a lot less judgment, then we're on the road to a lot more growth, I think, in a lot of ways.
David has, if you could just unmute yourself, please, David.
Yeah, please.
Just a quick comment. Rabbi, you said earlier about the ability to pause. And I think that's sort of a great mechanism to enable one to become soft in a moment, is just to pause. If one can have enough presence of mind, and maybe because you repeat the behavior to pause, then it enables you to reframe the moment or how you might respond. So I love that idea of the pause mechanism as valuable.
Yeah, it has become a personal practice of mine, for example, because I have learned from very bad choices that I have made to, if I get an email that I interpret as really harsh, I pause for at least 24 hours before I respond. Because unless it is a crisis situation, it does not need an immediate response.
So true.
And usually, and again, why do I do this? Because I learned from very poor choices I made, right? And, you know, and usually when you can return to that email later, like, oh, when I read it again a day later, it didn't seem nearly as bad as I thought it was. I mean, how many arguments have we had where we didn't pause and it just escalated and boom, and all of a sudden we're in like the stratosphere and it's like, wait a second, how did I get here?
I saw that Lynn has on her hand up, and I actually have one thing I also would like to say after.
Yeah.
Okay, Lynn.
If you'll allow me to share a short story, because this is all kind of playing out in my head. My husband and I were in a serious car accident on Thanksgiving. That was totally not our fault. We were busy going along 40 miles an hour, and the person coming the opposite direction decided not to look and to make a turn in front of us. We were fine. Airbags went off inside of the car. Everything looked okay. I mean, it was tossed around. But when we got out of the car and I looked at the front of the car, it was totally destroyed. And I mean, this is what the engineers do, right? They build it so that we can walk away. But it was an incredible shock. And my first thought, of course, was, you destroyed my car. Like, I have to call the insurance company. I have to get, and the young man it was a young man who was driving the other car, maybe somewhere in his 20s. And I was sitting sort of just taking this all in and sort of in shock. And he came over and he said, "I'm so sorry. I just wasn't looking." And I was about to turn to him and say, "It's okay." And I stopped myself. I was like so proud of myself, because it was a female response. "It's okay. It'll be okay. Everything will be okay." And I went, "No." And I just, with my body language, I kind of went, "I don't really want to talk to you. Go deal with the cop." But I hear this story, and it's like, I kind of did what the man in the story did. It's like, yeah, not getting off the hook quite yet. You need to go think about this. I'm not going to forgive you, like, in the moment. And I took care of myself. I didn't make myself go, "Oh, take care of him. It'll be okay." So it's just so interesting how this plays out. But I took that moment. I stopped myself and I said, "I really don't want to do that. I don't want to say that." And he's just going to have to live with this and figure it out on his own. So thank you for listening.
Lynn, that's beautiful. I want to reflect back two things that I really heard. One, you paused and you had that female response, which I feel like I totally can share that experience, where it's like, "Oh no, I'm hurting and my car is destroyed and it's Thanksgiving, but everything's fine," right? It's like, "No, my car is destroyed. You need to deal with this. I don't want to talk with you." So like that pause, I think, is so critical. And the second piece, and I think this is a really important piece that's a through line throughout the text, is this gentleman is taking care of himself by not saying it's okay. He's making it so that his neshama doesn't have to experience the additional humiliation of not only has been insulted, but then he doesn't feel like he can even express what his experience has been. So I just want to appreciate, Lynn, you sharing that with us in the way that it really reflects on this text in a lot of ways. And in our final few minutes, Rabbi Dan, did you want to say something?
I guess I just wanted to say it's probably for another day, but I'm also very curious about the response of the rabbi's students and how they were so quick to defend him, and just thinking about how in our lives, whether it's our rabbis, our mentors, our bosses, our therapists, our teachers, people who, whoever, like endless numbers of people who we might want to be a certain way. I remember once I was with one of my rabbis of blessed memory. I won't even name him now, but I was in my early 20s and I just revered him in certain ways. And then when he kind of said something to me that was like less than compassionate once, I just could not tolerate that and like shut down for a very long time. I eventually came back, but I think like it's interesting how what it takes to recognize when someone you hold to be a certain way is human and doesn't do something horrible, or like, well, actually in this case, it was horrible. So I guess the question is like, why were they protecting him? Why did they need to see him a certain way and not be able to recognize the complexity? So I know it could take us in a different direction, but I just wanted to lift that up, that I'm as interested in like the unnamed students as I am with the gentleman and the rabbi.
Yeah, and I just want to end by naming that as well. I mean, how often do we do that? As you were describing with your rabbi, as lots of us, I mean, think about, I mean, we can all probably think of, to go back to the entertainment industry, to go back to any number of the Me Too incidents, the ones we know and the many we do not know, how quick we are to immediately defend and how difficult it is to go through the defensive, and what work it takes to love yourself enough. And I think we're all works in progress on this. I know I am for sure. To love yourself enough to say, you know, I have to accept that this is not the way that I thought. And I have to be able to hold this person as a person. They're not my perfect reflection. Rabbi Jonathan Slater would often say to us in the clergy leadership program that we could not be frustrated with people for being failed versions of us. And that was a really good line. Like, other people are not failed versions of you, but we also have a responsibility, the students especially in this case, to say and to ask ourselves the question, why am I acting so swiftly to defend?
Yep.
We all do it. None of us want the things that we love and care about to be harmful to other people. Then we don't know what to do, right? How often do we find that, like, something we really care about is hurting someone else? Well, therefore, if that thing that I love is hurting you, then I can't love that thing anymore because that's a betrayal of you, right? And sometimes it really is, especially interpersonally. And often it's so much more complicated. And we as humans need to work on our skills around that. So I think actually, instead of ending with a guided practice, I think we're going to close. We're going to probably wrap it here, but I want to pass it back to Rabbi Diana for any closing thoughts or any closing words. And I really want to thank everyone for being here tonight and to learning together.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Tuchman. This was such an important and interesting study that we did together. And I just love studying with this community too. I really appreciate the depth and care and willingness to probe and question and share of this community as well. So thank you to everyone here, but really for coming with us into this little shul community, Rabbi Tuchman. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Rabbi Diana, and to the entire community for bringing me into your community, into your sacred space. It's been a real honor to be with all of you, and I certainly hope that our paths will cross again in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Shabbat shalom to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a
Shalom,
good night.
everybody. Thank you so much.